Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Mad Mamluks. I'm Mahin and I'm joined by my co-hosts Sheikh Amr Sayyid and Sim. And on today's show we welcome in studio Ali Harfouch, who is a lecturer at the American University of Beirut.
Right.
And is also an active member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which poses a problem for me because I'm applying for my U.S. citizenship right now, but that's all good. We'll let that slide. Brother Ali is originally from New Jersey, North Jersey, but went overseas about 10 years ago to get his bachelor's and master's over in Lebanon. So, Ali, welcome to our studio, our humble abode. Appreciate you coming through.
Barakallahu feek for having me.
Wafikum barakallah. So tell us a little bit about your backstory. You grew up in North Jersey, but what takes you to Lebanon of all places? I assume you just heard that Lebanese women are the finest Muslim women around.
No.
That's not the reason?
No, that was definitely not one of the primary reasons.
Don't worry, you'll get used to it. You'll get used to his questions.
I get used to his questions. Okay, no worries, inshallah. First of all, just to qualify, Ali, I usually just go by Ali S. Harfouch, because if you put Ali Harfouch on Google, you get like search results for this depth dancer. It's like this very famous, like effeminate Lebanese dancer,
Oh boy!
Just so that people know that I'm not that guy. Ali Sahih Harfouch. And just another qualification, I will begin lecturing at the American University, inshallah, as of fall. Before that, I was lecturing across different venues in Beirut. So just a brief background, like you said, I was born and raised in suburban New Jersey, small hometown called Hohokus. Then, around teenage years, I became interested in knowing more about the deen, knowing more about what is Islam, and became infatuated with Middle Eastern politics. And, growing up in a Lebanese household, you always hear stories about, politics back home and the wars and the civil war and all that stuff. So I decided, if I want to understand Middle Eastern politics or understand Islam, or, be part of something bigger than, my suburban small hometown in America, then I would have to essentially move back to my parents' homeland, quote unquote homeland, Lebanon. So I did that, and I enrolled in the American University of Beirut. I did my bachelor's degree in political studies, studied with some of the mashayikh in Beirut, coming out of Azhar and coming out of Mauritania, and scholars like that, including, a sheikh that I very much always, recommend that people, listen to and check out his work, Sheikh Hassan Qatirji. He's one of the muhaddithin from Sham. So I hung around him for a bit. And then 2 or 3 years ago, I was introduced to the party, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and kind of took off from there, completed my master's degree, and that's pretty much it.
Okay. Well, we had people on from Hizb ut-Tahrir before, and we've had people from other groups, let's just say, people who are Salafi or Sufi or, what we like to do on our podcast is bring everyone to the platform and let the best ideas win. And yes. I feel like that's the only intellectually fair approach that we have. So, for example, from the liberal camp, our most recent guest was Shadi Hamid, right? Mm-hmm. He identifies himself as a liberal loosely. He doesn't not to its logical end. And I appreciate that about him because he was very intellectually honest in the discussion that we had with him. And what I feel like is missing really from modern day discourse is just people being, bringing in their emotions as hostage to the discussion, and they can't be honest with each other in any kind of discourse, because when you talk to anyone and you feel like they're gonna explode by whatever you say, I feel like people just end up being quiet and they don't want that person to really go off the rails on them, So I think when we have everyone on the show, we have an honest, fair discussion. And sometimes some of our listeners weren't happy with some of the things that Shadi said, that they felt like we should have challenged them more. I feel like that could have happened. If we did do that, that whole episode could have just gone, on various different tangents, and we wouldn't have really had any kind of discussion. So sometimes we'll just let people say what they want to say.
Yeah.
And there's like brothers like Ali here who will be able to respond on the behalf of Islamists,
Yeah. But not only that, people just want it to be a debate all the time. We're just here to pick each other's brains, right?
Right.
And sometimes they think just because someone's a liberal, oh, you're not liberal, so how dare you have him on? It's not about that. It's just about discussing with people and just what makes them tick and how we can, make the gaps a little smaller between Muslims and stuff, But I had a quick question about University of Beirut, American University in Beirut. How sanctioned are the politics and political science? Are people usually, when they hear of Beirut or they even hear of American University of Cairo, it's very controlled and there's a certain area that you can't go towards when you're talking about politics. How is it there? Is it for the sake of academia, you can talk about whatever you want because academic discourse? How does that work?
So the American University of Beirut has been known, since the 1800s, to kind of be like the bastion of first, missionary movements, attempts to Christianize the Muslim world, and then it became, the hub for secularization and secularism, and producing some of, the Middle East's most well-known and infamous ideologues, the leaders of the Marxist movement, the Arab Ba'ath movement, and so forth. But that heritage no longer really stands. The campus is very much diverse, especially in terms of the faculty. So I think one of the things that helped me a lot in terms of my own intellectual development was that I was exposed to so many different diverse perspectives, professors who adopted, postmodern perspective, decolonial perspectives, Christian, scholastic perspectives and whatnot, or professors, who advocate straight up Marxist, classical Marxist positions and whatnot. And not just at the level of the faculty, but even the students. Beirut is also known to be very diverse intellectually. There's many different intellectual movements. You have your coffee shops with your old Marxists and young socialists and, Islamists sitting and debating and stuff of that sort. So very little is sanctioned. You pretty much have a free reign, to express all the ideas. As a matter of fact, the papers that I usually post to my profile on academia about Jahiliyyah and about Hakimiyyah were actually written under the encouragement of some of my professors, who actually encouraged me, articulate these ideas in a paper.
Even though they disagreed with you, probably some of them.
Of course.
That's
fundamentally
awesome. I honestly didn't know that existed in Lebanon just because of my ignorance, but I think a lot of people have that understanding too, that they still think it's like that situation where you can't talk about anything except, or you're going to be taken to jail or something like that. But I think Lebanon is quite different from your explanation.
It depends. I mean, if you're within the academic space, when you talk about general ideas and theories, then, that's one thing. But then transforming that or carrying that out into the public space as a political agenda, then that's another story. And that's a whole other experience I've had in terms of my run-ins with security there.
Yeah, I mean, I was on academia.edu to on your page basically of all your posts, and the one that stuck out the most I think to us was your writing on Jahiliyyah. And I mean, I encourage everyone to go and read those entries, but
we'll include a link in the episode description so you can check it out. We're not going to read the paper for you, but we're going to talk a little bit about why that subject is so important, because that's really the paper what I read that really introduced me to you, Ali. I didn't know anything about your background or anything. I'm like, oh wait, this guy, he's talking about something in a very intelligent, coherent manner, and he's got his thoughts really organized. And
plus, you need a dictionary for every sentence. MashaAllah,
tabarakallah.
Yeah. That's not much of a compliment.
If you read pop-up books like me, that article's not for you. Just listen to this podcast.
But you will benefit a lot. I mean, I loved how the thoughts were so organized from the beginning. Just a basic synopsis of what I understood. Tell me if I misunderstood it. You started on a very simple level just by talking about the human being himself, or just being, and how the being itself is in this world, right? And the being in this world obviously is given a view naturally, right?
Yes.
And the view that you have is going to reflect basically what your motives are and who you worship. But I've never seen anybody break it down. And then you led to Jahiliyyah from that, right? And I've never seen anybody break it down like that. Usually, because we were discussing this even before, is when people talk about Jahiliyyah, they just say ignorance, right? Which is fine. That's, linguistically, that's fine. But the change in the spin that you put to it, as far as the Quran is concerned now, and how the Quran changed the semantics, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what went into that? And if you can kind of give us a brief of how you kind of got into that and how you broke that down, it was very beautiful.
Barakallahu feek. I mean, it's been a work in progress. Very early in, to my youth, I was fascinated by the works of Sayyid Qutb and Muhammad Qutb. To the extent. In 2011, I made it a point to go and meet Muhammad Qutb himself, and ask him about some of these ideas. He's the brother of Sayyid Qutb, and he kind of expanded on his ideas and whatnot. He lives outside of Medina. He passed away recently, I think, at the age of 96. And my Sheikh Hassan Qatarji in Beirut was also very much an active reader and student of Muhammad Qutb. And so these ideas had always, been there in the back burner, like things that I used to think about, what is Jahiliyyah, what is Hakimiyyah. And then when I got into academia and, you're exposed to John Locke, Montesquieu, Heidegger, Michel Foucault, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and these philosophies, and you begin, you're exposed to the ideas of what is modernity, what is postmodernity, what is being, what is epistemology and whatnot. Interestingly enough, I had thought that through academia, I would be intellectually refined in the sense that, okay, I would do away with these quote-unquote dogmas of Sayyid Qutb. But instead, I found that much of what Sayyid Qutb was saying was actually being illuminated in these in these books that I was reading, in these philosophies, especially when it comes to modernity. So eventually, it was towards the end of my master's degree where I decided, okay, let me flesh out these ideas.
And when you say modernity, just for the listeners, when you say modernity, what context do you mean modernity in?
So when we speak of modernity, we're essentially speaking of a thought structure that emerged out of Enlightenment Europe. A certain set of thought structure that has its own metaphysics and its own epistemology and conception of man and politics and so forth.
Okay.
That's what, when I was doing my undergrad and my master's degree, that's essentially what I was trying to look at and try to study, from an objective perspective. And the deeper I got, reading these texts on modernity, the more I began to realize, like, wait a minute, this is Jahiliyyah in its most
even
pure...
though it's supposed to be highly educated.
Exactly. It's supposed to be, the ultimate maturity of man, the pinnacle of progress. And I'm reading this and I'm like, this is in Quranic terms, literally the epitome of Jahiliyyah. The state of the modern man, the condition of the modern man, the place that modern man has in the universe, his ability to act as a sovereign and replace God as the sovereign. And then that would take me back to Sayyid Qutb, the works I was reading, early into my youth. So then I decided, let me put all of this in paper and pen. And then eventually I wrote that paper. And then there's a follow-up paper about Al-Hakimiyyah. So the antithesis of Jahiliyyah, polar opposite, is Al-Hakimiyyah, which means sovereignty of God, sovereignty of Allah Azza wa Jal, or the Sharia, where I also go into it systematically.
So, a lot of people would take issue with you labeling Jahiliyyah or ignorance with, those philosophers, because they say philosophy is like, thinking dynamically and looking at things from different perspectives, and we have to study philosophy to understand different angles of understanding the reality. What's your problem, Ali? Why you got to get all Sayyid Qutb on us?
I understand that. I understand that. And, first and foremost, when we say that, Jahiliyyah or the modern state, let's say, or modernity is a manifestation of Jahiliyyah, right? We don't necessarily attribute this idea to Sayyid Qutb. If this idea is, the idea isn't legitimate because Sayyid Qutb said so, but because I personally believe that it is grounded in the Quranic narrative. It is grounded in the Quran and in the Sunnah, more specifically in the Islamic worldview, in the tawheedic, worldview, and within our aqidah. So that's, in my opinion, where the concept of Jahiliyyah gained its legitimacy, that it is an authentic Islamic concept. Now, just this brief background in terms of the idea has been controversial, and it's created, these divisions between thinkers and academics. For example, between Sayyid Qutb and Al-Hudaybi and some of his some of the people who came after him in Ikhwan al-Muslimin. Their contention was that Sayyid Qutb misunderstood Jahiliyyah in the Quran. They argued that Jahiliyyah, it's not a state of being, but it's a historical period which ended with prophethood.
When you say Ahd al-Jahiliyyah, the time of Jahiliyyah.
Exactly. It's a historical period that ended, when with the advent of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Sayyid Qutb came and said, you know what, no, and even Abu al-Ala al-Maududi and others, like, no, Jahiliyyah in the Quran refers to a state of being. It's a condition. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of understanding your relationship with God and your relationship with your fellow man and your relationship with nature.
Yeah.
And through my reading of, the text on modernity and its critiques, and my reading of the Quran and the Sunnah and even the books of tafsir, I found that no, this Jahiliyyah clearly indicates a state of being, and what we refer to as modernity or modern civilization or Western civilization is an example of the Jahili state of being, for reasons which I mention and I outline in the paper.
So I've got a question just to help you clarify that a little bit more. So we were talking before the show, my background was I used to be a part of the Madkhali movement, that wing of the Salafi Dawah, right? And obviously Sayyid Qutb is public enemy number one, right? You know that. And it's then obviously they're coming from the point of view of, well, Jahiliyyah is a time period and this is a bid'ah, and tawheed Hakimiyyah is bid'ah and all that stuff. And their attack on Sayyid Qutb individually is well, he's a thinker, he's an activist, he's not a scholar. He's talking about he's punching above the belt. He's above he's doing something above his pay grade, right? Yes. But can you talk a little bit about, is there precedence in scholarship for his for that view?
Definitely. So just to make a very important point in terms of when we're approaching these kind of topics, Jahiliyyah or Hakimiyyah, a common fallacy is poisoning the well. So attributing a particular idea to a certain figure and then de facto trying to delegitimize that idea. So irrespective of who Sayyid Qutb was, the question of whether or not Jahiliyyah as a state of being is a legitimate idea or illegitimate is a question of, is this grounded in the Quran and in the Sunnah? Yeah. That's the first thing. Second thing, Sayyid Qutb, in a way that's very similar to Ibn Taymiyyah, has been represented and framed in a particular way, right? In the same way many, contemporary Neo-Orientalist or Muslim apologetics associate Ibn Taymiyyah with, the
modern Salafi Dawah.
Exactly, the modern Salafi Dawah and, genocides against the Shia and so forth.
I mean, what they've done is framed Sayyid Qutb as the founder or the original founder of ISIS.
Exactly, which can't be anything further from the truth, because if someone, takes the time to actually read Sayyid Qutb's work beyond just, for example, a chapter from Milestones or reading what someone else said about Sayyid Qutb, you would find this, beautiful intellectual depth, and thought process. And very intimate connection with the Quran, this ongoing conversation with the Quran that's very animated in Sayyid Qutb's work. You would find that he was anything but, a predecessor or a catalyst for, the modern Salafi jihadi movements and so forth. And he explicitly addresses some of these issues, some of the complaints that have been made against him. That's another topic in and of itself.
But what shocked me, Ali, was that so many scholars who, in the wave of, after 9/11, and even after the onset of ISIS, people falling over themselves to blame Sayyid Qutb for it. Prominent scholars that you think of, out of the Gulf, they have, nice comfort, they're living in comfort, have no need to even comment about Sayyid Qutb, who's not there to defend himself. Went out of their way to say, he had problematic ideas that could have inspired violent jihadis. And help us understand this. What are they referring to where are they coming from in terms of what Sayyid Qutb actually wrote? Because everyone I know who's actually a practicing Muslim has read Milestones. Someone who is involved in some kind of dawah. Milestones was something that was a book that everyone in the 90s was reading.
I guess I don't count as practicing because I've never picked it up.
Well, you started with Abu al-Maududi, so you counted in some other way.
The Quranic translation.
So it doesn't matter. You were
I know who he was, though.
It doesn't matter.
Similar ideas.
There were the four horsemen: Abu al-Maududi, Sayyid Qutb, Taqiyuddin Nabhani, and pick your fourth.
What about Muhammad Surur?
No, I'll say Hassan al-Banna right there.
No, but one thing you have to understand. Number one, even Sayyid Qutb mentions that Abu al-Maududi was a big inspiration for him.
Yes.
Right. The second thing is that when we talk about a Quranic translation, that's actually a tafsir. The Quran actually can't be translated, right? So if you see the style of ideas of how Maududi Quran is quote unquote translated, Sayyid Qutb's tafsir is a very literary tafsir. I just want to touch upon this just so people understand who Sayyid Qutb actually was, as far because people think that he wasn't an academic and he wasn't a thinker and he was. If you were to read any tafsir in the world from the beginning of time, one of the most unique tafsirs, contemporary tafsirs, are what two people. If you study tafsir, especially in tafsir, there's two tafsirs that you have to read to understand what are very, very different stylistically, as far as what we would refer to as balagha or rhetoric, and at a very high level of language. Because you have to remember that Sayyid Qutb was an adib. He was somebody who was a very eloquent speaker and writer. So his Quran, his tafsir is written in that fashion, a very literary. Even the people who didn't like him were like, we have to read this. So even in academic circles, they have to read it because it's very thought-provoking. That's what's referred to as tafsir.
By academic circles, in like Azhar, for example.
No, not even just any academic who wants to know about the Quran, Muslim or non-Muslim.
Okay.
Right? Because the style that he wrote in, no one has ever written like that before. And even though it's a genre known as tafsir bil-ra'i, right? Tafsir that's supposed to make you ponder. That and another contemporary, his Muhammad Al-Amin Shanqiti, right? Somebody from a scholar from Mauritania, and he did the tafsir al-Quran with the Quran itself. But as contemporaries, these two individuals, no one has really written a tafsir like them, even though he's a contemporary. And if you read his tafsir, right, and there's an encouragement to learn the Arabic language, if you read his tafsir, you feel like you really grasp the Quran the way it's supposed to be grasped, because he's not talking about what people try to paint a picture of him as murderous and this and that. He's actually making you love the Quran,
So wait, he did a tafsir about the Quran with the Quran?
Muhammad Al-Amin Shanqiti. Shanqit basically is Mauritania.
And by the way, for non-Muslims or anyone who's not familiar, tafsir means exegesis or explanation of the verses.
Yeah, expounding on the Quran basically. He basically did his tafsir, meaning his explanation of the Quran with the verses of the Quran itself.
Yeah.
To put all the Quran into context. Right? Obviously he has his own words. He includes hadith. But the style is known as tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, right?
That's like eating the munchkin.
Oh my God. Let's not ruin this mood. I know you want to be a little goofy right now.
Then putting the donut inside there.
Yeah. So let me ask you, okay, Sheikh Amr. So, but again, the contention is, munchkin. I'm basically unloading all my PDF knowledge right now.
PDFs, refutations,
anything from Spubs and Troy. And shout out to Abu Khadija, by the way. If you're listening, we got you, Ak. Come on the show. Anyways, but on that, the tafsir of so don't you have to be like a mufassir to write a tafsir?
Of course.
So
what's Sayyid Qutb's qualification,
wrote it
right?
in jail.
Yeah, what's his qualification? Is he Hafiz? Did he study the usul and
you bring up a very important point, because that was one of the main things that you had heard after 9/11, these guys from the Islamic movements, the four horsemen, as I mentioned earlier, these guys, they never studied, they came from nobodies, they never heard of them.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
they have no isnad, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So how would you respond to that?
I mean, again, I'm very honestly hesitant in terms of when I'm introducing a particular concept or an idea or a narrative, attributing it to a particular individual or a particular persona or a particular movement, because that does one of two things. I think it distracts us from the main question, which is, again, is this idea, this concept or this narrative grounded in the Quran, grounded within our tradition? And then the second thing is it also reinforces certain frames and certain representations of individuals like Sayyid Qutb and whatnot. So, I mean, the question of Sayyid Qutb's tafsir and, fi dhillal al-Quran and the scholarship behind it and whatnot, this is something, at least in the Arab world, which was debated very thoroughly. It's a very saturated debate, and it's kind of reached a dead end. That being said, in his tafsir, Sayyid Qutb does clearly draw heavily on the works, for example, of Ibn Kathir, Zamakhshari, and others. So he's not starting off, from zero, basically, or from scratch. When it comes to questions, fiqhi questions, usuli questions, he does draw on the experts. But then when it comes to literary commentary, certain ideological ideas, certain concepts, such as the idea of legislation or hukum, for example, this is where Sayyid Qutb comes in and gives his perspective. And I think the real question should be not so much, okay, well, what are his qualifications, but then to take what he has said and then weigh against what the classical scholars have said and what the Quran and the Sunnah, what's in the Quran and the Sunnah. Yeah. And again, an example of such being the idea of Jahiliyyah, the concept of Jahiliyyah as a state of being, and, for example, the idea of Hakimiyyah. And I think,
I mean, was he a scholar who could issue religious edicts, though, just so that we can understand him a little bit better? Mm-hmm. Is he somebody who probably went to a Sharia university where he could, or graduated with a Sharia degree, in some facet or another, and was able to issue a fatwa on something?
Oh, he was specialized not in fiqh, not in jurisprudence, so he could not produce fatwa, but he was a scholar and he was an expert in language, in al-balagha, right? So he did have the qualifications needed to understand the Quran vis-a-vis Arabic semantics and Arabic balagha,
right,
which is a huge and foundational part of tafsir in and of itself.
Yeah, and a lot of his changes. I don't want to make this podcast all about Sayyid Qutb.
No, but the whole one of the main reasons why we're
not. I know.
Yeah, we can't skim over it because
right.
Jahiliyyah, the whole concept of it being misunderstood in modern society, is because of Sayyid Qutb's understanding of Jahiliyyah and how he viewed the world today. And this is why we're kind of talking about the subject, because it's such an important topic to really understand, and it can really create a correct framework in Muslim minds around the world if you understand it properly.
Yeah, and to Ali's point about like the individual versus the concept, we habitually, I do the same thing, that we're habitually, like, we get credibility by the people. Like, people will say, Ghazali said this, or so we can't just gloss over that. We have to, like, show, like, okay, that question has to be addressed.
Yeah. Because what he's talking about is, like, when we hear something, we say, okay, well, what are his qualifications? It's almost like a natural reaction.
How long is his beard,
for example?
So, I'll be like,
accreditation?
Because I'll be like, yo, dude's clean shaven, man. Like, what qualifications does he have?
I don't think he could grow a beard even if you wanted to.
You can take steroids for that stuff.
Many Egyptians can't grow.
You can take steroids for beard or something.
But so but a lot of people,
you get my point,
they'll say, what are his credentials, right?
Yeah.
But what I was gonna say was, I didn't want to make this all about Sayyid Qutb, but I think we should. But his understanding of what he was trying to say in Milestones of Jahiliyyah, what you were saying in your papers was a very fluid way. He had a different approach to it, and Muslims all along, in history, have talked about Jahiliyyah.
Well, Jahiliyyah is the pre. Before any Sirah book starts, they talk about the days of Jahiliyyah. That's the first chapter in every Sirah book.
Yeah, and so everybody has to refer to that phrase, right?
Correct.
Everybody has to refer to that phrase. Even the saying of Umar radiallahu anhu, no one's going to understand Islam until they knew Jahiliyyah, paraphrasing. So what ended up happening is that when Sayyid Qutb started talking about Jahiliyyah, he was talking about his surrounding and making people wake up. Hey, we're living in exactly what Allah told us not to do, and why the prophets came in the first place, right? The prophets came because of what we see all around us.
Yes.
So, but it was so lethal for him to talk about that he actually, talking about his tafsir, he wrote his tafsir in jail, right? And he was hung for writing that book, Milestones, right?
What was his context though? So let's go back to, was it 1940s Egypt, 1950s Egypt? What's he
late
seeing?
30s, yeah. Well,
So what's he seeing at that time then that makes him develop this this realization?
So first, just so we timeline, and correct me if I'm wrong, Hassan al-Banna started his initial dawah in the late 30s, right?
1928 to be
Was it 1928 or 1930? Okay, 1928. Okay. And what was the timeline where Sayyid Qutb caught onto it?
So Sayyid Qutb entered, if I remember correctly, the Muslim Brotherhood. I think his interest began in the mid-1940s.
Okay.
Then his career was launched in the 1950s up until his execution in 1966.
Yeah.
So Sayyid Qutb's ideas kind of evolved over time, beginning with his first book about social justice in Islam, and then culminating in Milestones, which was kind of a synthesis and a summary of his work. Basically, he wanted to write some kind of manifesto to leave behind for the Muslim world and whatnot.
Okay.
In his writing.
So what would you say in regards to the current state of the world? Are we living in a Jahiliyyah world, or are we living in a world that is the prevailing ideology is Jahiliyyah? Like, is it just the thoughts and ideas that are prevalent in the world, or is it the practicing the actions of the world? Is that what makes Jahiliyyah? Like, what are we talking about essentially?
I mean, that's a good question, and that brings us back to the original point, which is, what is Jahiliyyah? Right? What does Jahiliyyah refer to in the Quran? What does it refer to linguistically? And how does it, what is the context of this debate in the modern world, or in, contemporary America or the Middle East and so forth? So just to take a brief step back, right, and just fly through the argument quite briefly, and then inshallah ta'ala you can find the details in the paper. But essentially the argument that I try to make, and drawing on classical Islamic scholarship, is that jahl, the word jahl, which is the root word of jahiliyyah, refers linguistically to ignorance, correct? And when we approach any Arabic word in the Quran, such as jahl, jahiliyyah, jahilun, there are two meanings. You have the linguistic meaning, and then you have the conceptual meaning which the Quran gave this particular term. So it's a new meaning that was attributed through a Quranic semantic structure. For example, the word salat, salah, right? The word salat linguistically means dua, means supplication. But when the Quran introduced a new semantic structure, the word salat came to mean what we now know as that those set of actions which begin with takbir and end with taslim. The word kufr, kafir, a kafir linguistically was a farmer, someone used to cover the dirt, cover the seed. The Quran came and gave us a new definition, a new conceptual meaning for kafir. And the same thing applies to the word tughyan, takabbur. Tughyan means to transgress. Takabbur means to arrogate oneself, to sublimate oneself. And I address these in the paper as well. Now, the word jahl is no different. The Quran comes and treats jahl and jahili in a very specific way. The word jahl, ignorance, in the Quran does not refer to the absence of knowledge, but it refers to incorrect knowledge, misconstrued knowledge, knowledge that is not in accord with reality. So, for example, if you were to ask me, is there a red car outside of this room? And in reality, there is a red car. And I said, no, this is not what the Quranic scholars refer to as jahl. That's merely the absence of knowledge. But if I told you, yes, there is a car outside of this room, but it's not red, it's blue, that's jahl, because it's knowledge that is not in accord with the reality. So when the Quran introduced this new conception, we find this, for example, just to give an example of such, when Allah Azza wa Jal in the Quran repeatedly refers to Quraysh, and the tribes at that time as being, amongst the people of Jahiliyyah. Yeah. Yet in the Quran, when, Allah says, for example, and if you were to ask them who created them, they would say Allah.
Yeah.
So they recognize, not only did they recognize Allah's existence, but they recognize Allah's cosmic sovereignty and that Allah was the creator and the provider. But then why were they referred to as Jahiliyyah? Because their understanding of Allah Azza wa Jal and their understanding of man-God relations was misconstrued, and it was not in accord with the reality of things, or how God ought to be perceived and understood, and how the relationship between man and God ought to be understood. And then, I mean, again, this is a theme throughout the Quran, and we explain this in the paper, the different ways in which Jahili is used. But essentially, the core argument is this. Jahiliyyah in the Quran refers to a false worldview, an incorrect worldview, by which I mean, again, a particular conception of God and a particular conception of God-man relations. Now, when you have a false worldview, it follows that any other derivative ideas, such as your political concepts, your economic concepts, the way in which you believe society ought to be regulated, your notions of legitimacy and legislation, and even dress, all of these things, given that they manifest from a false worldview, then they would also be Jahili systems. And that's why in the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal also refers to Jahili as a way of dressing, right? Allah refers to the Quran as a way of thinking, as a mode of relations and so forth. But again, that all emanates from a foundational false worldview in relation to God and the relationship between man and creation. And then I use this to segue into modernity. So what implications does that have for the modern world? So to answer your question, do we live under a Jahili order? I think the answer resoundingly is yes, most certainly so. And I think if we look at some of the scholarship that's coming out even within Western academia.
Wait, so you said a Jahili order?
Yes.
Okay, what do you mean by that? A Jahili
by order, I mean modernity as a complete order of being. So as a political, economic, and social structure.
Okay.
As a system of international relations, but primarily as a thought structure.
Because I know some snarky listener will say, well, I'm in Medina right now, and what are you calling my society? Jahil society? That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about the prevailing systems of governance or even ideas or philosophies.
Yes, what constitutes the modern world in thought and in practice.
Okay.
The realm of policy, the realm of culture, and even the realm of academia. And also something that's very interesting, more than often, when we were reading about these topics like Sayyid Qutb and the idea of Jahiliyyah, and then when we jump back into our academic world and we read, the works of like Peter Gay, Wael Bihalaq, Michel Foucault, Nietzsche, and so forth, we tend not to make an association. In reality, I think if we look at some of the literature that's coming out and about modernity and about the philosophical shallowness of modernity, for example, Patrick Deenan in his most recent work, Why Liberalism Failed. It's a book that was caused a lot of debate within Washington and whatnot. If you pick up a book that's written by a conservative and you look at the reasons as to why he believes liberalism failed, immediately one of the first things which comes to mind is, this is exactly what the Quran was describing. So, for example, his argument is that liberalism failed essentially because it's premised in a very shallow and materialist conception of man and nature and a deistic concept of God. And, Wael Bihalaq, for example, in his book Restating Orientalism, makes a very similar case in terms of the prevailing thought structures on modernity, all of which reinforce the idea that two things: that one, that modernity is based on a particular worldview, and two, that worldview has a very specific dogmatic conception of man-God relations and conception of God in relationship to the universe. And in Quranic, according to the Quranic narrative, these definitely fit the characteristics of Jahiliyyah.
So is it safe to say, so is it safe to say that modernity is a type of aqidah or is backed by a certain aqidah of what we understand aqidah, a belief? Because a belief is something that charges your actions, right?
Yes.
It's a belief inside of here, what you think is the best way to conduct your life, and your limbs are going to act accordingly.
Yes.
Right? So that is a type of aqidah. And I think that that's something that has to be clarified, is that any type of idea or way of life that is conducted, you're believing this is the best way or this is my way of life.
Yes.
So when we say, that's why I love Hamza Zortz's his book, The Divine Reality. I love the title of that book, is because divinity nowadays is seen as something that's folklore, but he says it as reality because it's what we believe is real. This is our real world. Allah is the true real thing to us.
Yes.
Everything else is, so the only realness can come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yes.
And if that realness, obviously it is from Allah, then anything that's not from Allah is not reality, which is kind of the opposite, which is Jahiliyyah. Because Jahiliyyah is misplacing knowledge or not putting knowledge where it's supposed to be, right?
Exactly.
So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us reality, or given us how to understand reality in Himself subhanahu wa ta'ala, anything opposing that would not be with the lens of reality, rather with the lens of Jahiliyyah.
Exactly. It would not be in accord with the reality, the nature of things, the natural order of things.
Natural order, yeah.
Yes.
So is modernity just an amalgamation of capitalism, postmodernism, and a few other isms that really are the prevailing inclinations of a society? Is that what we're defining modernity as?
That's a very good question, and the reason it's also a critical question is because it defines the terms of our debate and how we engage with modernity. I think one of the prevailing misconceptions is that modernity refers to a project or there's some kind of universal ethic or a certain kind of political order. In reality, if we look at modernity, purely in terms of its historical evolution and the ways it, was transformed and manifested into certain ideas and orders and whatnot, we find that it began as a thought structure. It began as a metaphysic. It began as an aqidah, as a worldview. And that worldview, the fundamentals of that worldview were actually the common ground, the basis that was shared by different Enlightenment thinkers, different modern thinkers, irrespective of their differences when it comes to politics. So, for example, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? Or Thomas Hobbes, right? These are three thinkers who had, in political science, you can say they had fundamentally different political visions in terms of the nature of man, yet they shared that modern metaphysic, which is the idea that we essentially live within a mechanical or a mechanistic universe that can function on its own, a universe that is divorced from the sovereignty or the omnipotence of God. So God becomes a sort of watchmaker, who creates the watch and then sits back. And so this deistic conception of God and this mechanical conception of the universe and of course of man and nature is what really informed modernity. That's what I mean when I talk about the worldview of modernity. In that regards, there's a recent text, and I think I mentioned it, Wa'il Bihallaq, his book Restating Orientalism. It is absolutely brilliant precisely because he brings the debate on modernity to the level of worldviews, to the level of metaphysics that I was referring to.
Is that the book you have right now?
Yeah.
Can you hold it up for the cameras for the listeners?
Well, I don't have the book cover, but it's Restating Orientalism.
Okay. We'll include the description of the book.
A critique of modern knowledge. Yeah. So, that's definitely a good, a good.
Yeah, Wa'il Bihallaq was recommended by many other podcast guests, so definitely check out this author. Brilliant, and I have one of his books called The Impossible State.
Yes.
He's I don't know why I've never heard of him until we started this podcast, until a lot of our guests started mentioning him, but just amazing reviews all around from everyone.
Yeah, I'm confused with Walid Shobait or some guy.
Oh, that's a
different guy. It's always like I get confused with W names, but
he's probably thought of the guy from Google in the Egyptian Revolution, Wa'il Ghunim.
Oh yeah, him too.
Yeah.
So real brief, who is this guy? And I know we were talking offline about his book, but even this book that you have necessarily isn't the first book you should. If you want to get into him, you're not supposed to read this book first, right?
So Wa'il Bihallaq, he's a professor in Islamic studies. I believe he's currently based in Columbia University. Arab-Palestinian, Christian background, which is very interesting because this man has an encyclopedic knowledge of Sharia and
Wait, he's Christian?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
He's a Christian. He's Arab Christian, which is I mean, many, academics will tell you that's a shocker.
Yeah.
Precisely, not only because he has this encyclopedic understanding of Islam and of fiqh, even ilm al-rijal wal-jarh wal-ta'dil, but even his defense of Islam, like his defense of Islamic governance, and his defense of Sharia, for example, as a moral cosmology in the impossible state.
Are you sure you're not doing taqiyya?
That's what I was exactly thinking the same thing.
Is that why you were smirking?
I was like, yeah, this guy's a Christian doing taqiyya. He's actually Muslim.
No, he's probably just. There's a lot of people who do a lot of deep work, and they're heavy researchers, and they just love it.
That's just like he probably is passionate about, because like the Trinity is probably so basic that he got bored with it.
For those who don't know what taqiyya means, it's a rule in Islam when your life is under danger. You can say that you're not Muslim. Like if someone's saying that, hey, or is persecuting you because of your religion, you can, for that moment, say that you're not that religion. And it's a source of a lot of controversy because there's Islamophobes out there who say that
everything we say is taqiyya.
Yeah, everything is taqiyya, and that's not what it is. But I'm glad we got to get a little taqiyya reference in the show.
One of the things that's actually very impressive about Al-Halaq's work is that he's very transparent.
Yeah.
So he calls into question certain academic dogmas which otherwise people would not even address. And actually, his book Restating Orientalism is in one ways a foundational critique of modern academia. So transparency for Wa'il Bihalaq is definitely not an issue. I think if he had any ideas, I think he would, pretty much put them on paper and pen.
I think it actually is beneficial that he's Christian, that he's not Muslim, because it gives him, because if he's Muslim, people are like, well, he's biased.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They can't accuse him of being biased.
Yeah.
Well,
right,
then no, the problem is then even Muslims just end up saying, oh, well, then he's an Orientalist because he's from a Western university and he's studying.
You mean to disregard
that's actually what is
disregard his valid points?
That interestingly enough, that's exactly what part of he calls it restating Orientalism because he's critical of this idea that just because a non-Muslim is speaking about the Orient does that make him an Orientalist?
Right.
So does everything that Wa'il Bihalaq say de facto become illegitimate because he's a non-Muslim speaking outside of the Orient? He kind of attacks the idea, not kind of, he thoroughly attacks that idea as being, somewhat superficial, not somewhat, thoroughly superficial.
Yeah.
And I think it's very convincing.
I think that's true. I think that's one of the problems that postmodernism is bringing, these power dynamics, like, you're talking about something from outside your worldview. Well, sometimes people need to be out of that sphere and look at some of the behavior. Like, for example, our podcast got into a little bit of trouble by talking about some of the Black Lives Matter movements, and we were just kind of saying like, hey, from the outside perspective, when we're looking at it, it seems there's some involvement with certain things that that might not be the best for you. You're associating yourself with people that may not have your best interests at heart. And people started messaging us and saying, how dare you bunch of brown guys talking about black people's problems. You're from the suburbs. How would you ever understand what we're going through?
I buy Air Jordans. That's why I know.
Yeah, that's right.
Because we watch basketball and listen to hip hop, right? I don't listen to hip hop, but Sheikh Ahmed, when he was
I sag my pants in high school.
In his Jahiliyyah.
Yeah.
That's actually something we were talking
See how
about.
I snuck that in?
Yeah. So that's something people talk about. So can you give it context when people say, we already know that there's some historians or some scholars said that it's a time frame. Jahiliyyah was a time frame and it ended. It's never coming back. It was just a label that was given to pre-Islam, basically.
Yes.
So when somebody says, in my Jahiliyyah, this is, or in our Jahiliyyah, this is what we used to do. How are they using that word?
I mean, I think it's just like common vernacular, it's like a common popular term referring to, in my pre-Islamic days, whether it's, before I converted to Islam or before I began practicing. I mean, there's some truth to it, and that's what I'm arguing, that a person can be in a state of Jahiliyyah.
Yeah.
Even after the advent of prophethood and the end of prophethood.
Yeah. So one last thing I want to say about this, because you guys don't mind if I'm going to the Hakimiyyah part, right? Because it's a small thing I want to just shed light on that, inshallah. As far as Jahiliyyah, number one, especially for the listeners, this is going to be a paper, if you get a chance to read it, the way it's described, alhamdulillah, is broken down so easily, so simply, that I honestly haven't seen broken down on that level. So, and it changes the perspective. The second thing that we have to learn is that Jahiliyyah is not just a mindset, not just a lens that we see through, but it is anything that's opposing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what satisfies Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So it seems as if the next portion, which is I think just as important, is the Hakimiyyah. Yes. It's almost like you mentioned, it's like an opposing idea.
Yes.
It's like night and day.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So as far as can you just shed a little bit of light on how it's opposing and what we should expect, just to entice us to read that, entice our listeners to read that,
yes.
piece of yours.
So, inshallah ta'ala, one of my, upcoming short-term goals is to merge those two papers into a book, but, towards a groundwork for a philosophy or a metaphysics of liberation in Islam. But the two papers are available. So one of the reasons I begin with Jahiliyyah and then move on to Hakimiyyah is because I believe that these two polar opposites are actually embedded within the kalima, the shahada. So as Muslims, when we come out and we say La ilaha illallah, what we're doing is we're beginning with a negation, right? A negation of any reality or any particular order other than that of Allah Azza wa Jal. And when we say illallah, we're affirming the sovereignty, and not just cosmic sovereignty, that Allah is the creator, but the cosmic and the temporal legislative sovereignty of Allah Azza wa Jal as being the ultimate, absolute, transcendent being.
Yeah.
So Jahiliyyah, we're negating, when we say La ilaha, that's essentially a negation of the Jahili realities that we find ourselves in or that we are competing with. When we say illallah, that is reaffirming the sovereignty of Allah Azza wa Jal.
Yeah. And the reason why that's so important is your word, in the words that you use to describe that. When we were growing up, we learned it means there's no God but God, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is final messenger. Or they say there's none worthy of worship but Allah, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is final messenger. So what that alludes people to is that as long as you don't worship idols, you're fine.
Yes.
And that's how Islam is actually taught. And I think that's generally why people got into movements, is because they saw a whole different side of what La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah means. Usually when people say La ilaha illallah, it just means, there's no God but Allah, because the people, they worship idols.
Yes.
And they associate partners with Allah.
Yes.
Which is like tawheed uluhiyyah.
Yeah. Don't commit shirk. And Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the final messenger. That's all it means.
Yes.
But in reality, that's not all it means. That's the reason why Sayyid Qutb was killed.
Yes.
Is because he brought a different understanding, a real, genuine understanding of what it meant to be Muslim at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I am not accepting this order because it's not from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I may have to live in it.
Yes.
It may be temporary. It may be permanent. But it's not the order.
Yes.
The order is from Allah. Right? And when we say there's none worthy of worship but Allah, when we utter those words, again, it's not just to picture idols in your mind. Hey, I'm not worshiping idols. I'm all good.
Yes.
It doesn't have anything to do with that. Because ideas and concepts are very, very powerful.
Yes.
And they will control your behavior. I was just talking to one of my friends, and we're talking about liberalism. And he's like, he always says, I'm a liberal, you know that, and he starts his conversation when we're talking about Islam.
Or feminists, they don't understand the meaning, or I'm a capitalist, because they're associating one aspect of an ideology with the entire ideology. Like, for example, the free market, right? People associate capitalism with the free market as if that's the only thing that capitalism represents.
Yes.
But it's much more than that.
But see what you're saying.
Yeah, and people say like, "Oh, I'm a capitalist true and true to the heart." Like, you don't know what you're saying.
No, but not only that, what you're saying exactly is what he was talking about, is Jahiliyyah.
Yeah.
Because they think, I'm a liberal. That's all that they need to know in order to understand life. Yeah. This is my mindset, and this is my best way to conduct my worldview. This is the lens in which I see everything. And that leads, and I told him, you keep saying that, but these are the very grounds that bring people to atheism. Right? These are the very grounds, this mindset, which atheism is not too far away from that. Because when they hear verses of the Quran, and it goes against everything that their instinct is, right?
Right.
They hear, like, they get ashamed when verses of the Quran talk about hellfire, they hate talking about hellfire. They feel embarrassed.
Okay.
When they talk about jihad, they feel very embarrassed. When they talk about battles, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about ordering the Muslims, to go into battle, or they feel very embarrassed and like, dude, that can't be Islam.
But
right?
so what do you think that? And I think you're onto something. At first, I was like, what you were saying was abstract, but you're saying that all these ideologies have something in common.
Yes.
What is that?
Jahiliyyah.
No, I know, but Jahiliyyah, but what inherently within human beings is really, moving them
searching.
towards.
Exactly. I mean,
right?
It's their own inclinations, right? It's like their own emotional attachment to, whatever they feel like, I feel like it's unfair that, Muslim women inherit less than their brothers in the laws of inheritance, or
but that's a beautiful. I know what you're saying.
But
that's a beautiful thing about the Arabic word is hawa, right? It's actually also one of the meanings of something which is like a breeze, because it's so light, it just gets pushed away and you can't even see it. That's how light it is. But you can kind of feel it, and that's how their whims are. That's how their whims work.
And
right?
I mean, that's how, as Muslims, when people speak of, this modern civilization, technological progress, this all-powerful, godlike Western civilization, we have to go back and remember, exactly as you said, that this is a civilization built on hawa. Built on a breeze. So its foundations, are built in sand. It's not something that it does represent a formidable challenge to Muslims because we are ignorant of its foundations, but it in no way is an intellectual challenge to Islam.
Yes.
In any sense of the word.
And people we shouldn't be deceived as believers that just because we have, people always talk about, we came out with the internet, we have this, that is not what we're talking about. Is what is the criterion to see if you're educated or if you're somebody that is very in good hands, or you're safe, you're the best of civilization because of that. We don't, as Muslims, as believers, we don't see that as best of civilization. We see them as tools that's there, but that by no means is the measure of intellect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Of course. I mean, this is very much a modern dogma, a modern myth. That knowledge essentially refers to scientific and empirical knowledge.
Exactly.
Whereas we know, I mean, unfortunately, in the public space, it's still very much a popular idea, but it's very much now, even within academics, it's established that, when we refer to knowledge, we're not just referring to scientific knowledge. And if anything, if there's something that we can get also from the Quran, and the way the Quran addressed previous civilizations is that this scientific knowledge is one thing. So scientific knowledge and empirical knowledge tells us what we can do, but our aqidah tells us what we should do. And that's precisely why, for example, modern civilization has taken these technologies and completely degraded them and used them, for maximizing pleasure, for economic degradation, creating the hydrogen and the atomic bomb. These advances in technology, are they being used for the betterment and the moral culturing of man, or are they being used for ends that align with our hawa or our desire? I think that in and of itself should be enough of a demonstration that purely scientific knowledge and technological progress does not amount to knowledge in its pure form, or does not negate the fact that these technologically advanced societies are also Jahili societies.
There you go.
So now, Sayyid Qutb's back to the question I asked maybe like 20, 30 minutes ago, is like, what again was his, when he's looking around, he's like, we're living in that Jahiliyyah. Like, because I was going to ask, like, did Jahiliyyah just start when the Ottoman Caliphate fell? Is it an issue of governance? Is that like the underlying thing?
Was Jahiliyyah existing during the Ottoman Caliphate? Okay. I mean, that's what we're trying to figure out, I guess. Yeah.
So, I mean, the question isn't whether or not, Jahiliyyah and Islam, most certainly Jahiliyyah and Islam can't coexist within one particular, territory or one land or one particular individual. If only because, for the same reason, Iman and Kufr cannot exist in the heart. Tawheed and Shirk, cannot exist within one heart. That's what Allah says in the Quran, that we have not created man with two hearts, right? It's either Iman or it's Kufr. Iman or its polar opposite. But that's not to say that you can't have an Islamic civilization and
with elements of Jahiliyyah in it.
With elements of Jahiliyyah
Yeah.
in it, and a competing, Jahili civilization, which was the case when you had the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Khilafah, and the competing European states and Anglo-European alliances and whatnot.
Can I stop you for a second? I want to back. I see you're formulating a point here, and there's some questions I already have in your first assumption, like the whole thing about it's Iman and Kufr can't exist in the same heart. Like it sounds good on paper, but reality is if you look a lot of Muslims, they have doubt, or they might have some kufr ideology.
It might not be kufr akbar. Maybe they're not associating partners,
exactly.
Explicitly with Allah, but they have
There's
things that they would, so just like how I said regarding feminist Muslims who might say I feel like it's unfair that women don't get an equal share in inheritance, and that when you are ignoring a verse or upset about a verse, that may be an element of kufr, but that's not necessarily taking them out of the fold of Islam. So let's. So
what he's trying to say is what the verse is referring to is that there's Iman and there is no Iman, right? But those people who have Iman, they may have weaknesses, but they still believe in La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, right? You can't believe in Allah and not believe in Allah at the same time.
Okay.
You understand what I'm saying?
So the weakness isn't necessarily... The weakness might be a shade of kufr, right?
Yeah.
Could you... Or is that unfair to say?
Or elements.
Yeah?
Yeah, because some things that are haram and done repetitively is considered an act of kufr, maybe, but it doesn't mean you're a kafir. It doesn't make you a kafir.
Sure.
Right?
So if there is an Ottoman state, let's just say right before its fall in 1924, that, in what is it? March 3rd, 1924. So let's just say it was January or February of 1924. The society is still not a Jahili society of the world. Is that what you're saying?
I would say yes. It was not for several reasons, given the definition of Jahili in the Quran.
Yeah.
One, that the Ottoman Khilafah and Ottoman society at that time was still very much grounded and based on an Islamic thought structure, on an Islamic worldview. That's one. And two, in terms of governance, again, what I was trying to say earlier is that one of the foundational characteristics of Jahiliyyah, which emanates from a false knowledge about God, is essentially when man becomes the new sovereign, man becomes the new God, right? And this was a characteristic which was completely absent from Islamic governance, where sovereignty belonged to the Sharia.
Yeah. But
this was a common feature. This was one of the embedded fixed elements and characteristics of Islamic governance from the time of prophethood until the fall of the Islamic Caliphate. That sovereignty did belong to the law, which essentially is the Sharia.
Yeah. So what another way how I would answer that question is Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's lifetime,
right,
and his rule in Medina, and the 4 Khulafa, right? From Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's time, his rule had no Jahiliyyah in it.
Right.
And that was based on divine reality, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
Right? And then there was Abu Bakr's 2-year phase, right?
Right.
Which he was doing a lot of, what's that word that's used? Not disaster relief, man. What do you call it when you're...
Crisis management.
Crisis management, thank you. And then you have Umar radiallahu anhu's rule.
Yeah.
Right? Which was...
Expand.
Yes. Expansion time, and with all the beautiful stories of nobody gives zakat to.
Oh, that's a good point right now. So the lands that Umar expanded into, they were being ruled by Islam, but they're primarily non-Muslim, right?
Yeah.
Because they were conquered, like Persia and Egypt and these North African lands that are being acquired, primarily non-Muslim population, right? Mm-hmm. We all can agree on that.
Yes.
But they're being ruled by Islamic laws.
Mm-hmm. Yes. It's the dominant. So it's a dominant rule that's giving direction to people. Is what we're talking about is Jahiliyyah, not
exactly.
Jahiliyyah. The people are going to be. That's why. Just let me finish that point. Yeah. And then you have, all of Islamic Muslim history. Right. Some historians believe, right, that since it was kind of like a kingship, it didn't follow the criteria of true khilafah because it was inherited from son to son to son to son. So it didn't follow that. But still, even though there may have been elements of Jahiliyyah in there, the main motive here was to rule by what Allah has revealed, with the understanding of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the ijtihad al-fuqaha, meaning Islamic Sharia, right? Sharia law. So the original element was for the satisfaction of Allah, and what does Allah want from us? That's how we're going to conduct ourselves as a civilization. Now, there may be elements of Jahiliyyah. You could find Jahiliyyah anywhere, anytime, right? Yeah. No matter, you have the most pious of people, and you'll have, people talk about, Andalusia, and even though Andalusia was amazing in Spain, but you're going to find elements that's just humans, right? That's the reason why Allah gave us a concept of halal and haram, because we're going to fall in either or, right?
So this is what you were talking about by Hakimiyyah. This term Hakimiyyah is the rule of Islam over a land that takes a land or the prevailing state of society from Jahiliyyah to
because Islam. I think with the condition of what you were speaking of, Hakimiyyah, again, it's a mindset, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to mean that everyone in the society is Muslim.
Of course, here we're referring to the ideological foundations, or the dominant thought structure that undergirds or that underscores any particular society.
Question: So recently, we alluded to Dr. Shadi Hamid. One of our more recent guests was talking about the concept of an Islamist, and his definition being an Islamist is someone who not only believes in an Islamic worldview as far as a state, but also is working towards it through various means. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I mean, I think the term Islamist is problematic because it kind of divorces our political obligations away from our identity as a Muslim, generally speaking. And, I mean, look, like when you take into consideration this issue of Jahili and Hakimiyyah, what's at stake here when we talk about, establishing the sovereignty of God, the sovereignty of Allah Azza wa Jalla and the Sharia, what's at stake here is not some kind of abstract political commitment. Here we're talking about something which is fundamental to tawheed, very fundamental to the kalima. You see what I'm saying? So I think what this term Islamist does is it in a way depoliticizes Islam and then politicizes a certain group of activists who are seen as existing independently of the Islamic tradition. So I mean, I'm critical on the term in and of itself. And look, I mean, in regards to Shadi Hamid, one thing that you have to respect, or I respect tremendously about his work, is that he's very transparent. He had the audacity, in a good sense, and the boldness to come out and say, no, Islam is exceptional. Yeah. Even though that this narrative has been so, this idea that Islam is exceptional has been,
something that it was almost an embarrassing point.
It was a very embarrassing, contentious point. Even within Muslims, even among Muslim apologetics. So Shadi Hamid comes out, even as a liberal, says, you know what? No, Islam is exceptional in this sense, that there hasn't been this, sacred secular divide in the Islamic tradition. So that's something I definitely respect. But that being said, if you recognize that the sacred and the political and the sacred are not mutually exclusive in Islam, then to what extent does the category of Islamist mean anything?
Yeah.
Any Muslim becomes an Islamist, and any Islamist is in reality a committed Muslim. And what I think, and at the end of the day, he's working within a vocabulary that is essentially secular, that we've inherited, these categories of thought.
The framework is already kind of crippled. It's a difficult framework to
It's
work
already
with.
been defined for us, and he's speaking within the realm of policy and Western academics. So obviously, we have to take that into consideration.
He contends the idea that the Westphalian nation state cannot be broken. At least if an Islamic governance came true to its form, a caliphate or a state that ended up electing a leader, or even a leader came through coup d'etat or any other means, and he declared an Islamic government, that state would still be confined to its borders, and the most that they could have hoped for is building an EU type of a.
And this is very common even among so-called Islamist ideologues and thinkers. Prominently with the Muslim Brotherhood. I think Shadi Hamid's idea, right, that by the way, this is also Wa'il Bihallaq's argument that Sharia cannot be restored in the modern world. I think that emanates from certain misconceptions. The first of which is trying to understand all Islamists within one lens. So yes, it's true that you do have movements like the Muslim Brotherhood and others who have essentially accepted modernity as the ultimate end of things, the ultimate reigning framework under which we engage with politics. So that does make sense. And there are many Islamic movements that are seeking to accommodate the nation state or to Islamicize the nation state and so forth. So from that perspective, if we're referring to the mainstream Islamist, then yes. Another thing, there's this sense of pessimism, and I think this pessimism is the product of ideological inculcation. And by ideological here, I'm referring to this idea that we've reached the end of history. So even though, thinkers like Shadi Hamid and others who are quote-unquote critical of the end of history narrative, they still somewhat have internalized it by making the statement or the suggestion that there's no way we can transcend the Westphalian modern order, as though it's become essentialized and we're living at the end of times. As though the only thing beyond modernity is the apocalypse or non-being.
The implementation of the Westphalian state took hundreds of years.
Exactly, it was a process.
A minimum of 300 years.
Exactly, it was a process.
And it happened through colonization, and it happened through a lot of, European actors involving themselves throughout the world. And after thinking about that podcast we had with him, it just dawned on me that, like, what's to say that the Westphalian state can't collapse in that same manner? That it may not be overnight, but it can, through whether it's economic downturns or just the winds of history taking its course.
Yes.
Why is it that, like, it's such an operator that can't be changed, a variable that's fixed? Why is it that the Westphalian state is a given baseline that we're all
Is it probably because people have just bought in on a mass level? So even like Islamists, even like Muslim Brotherhood, right? They have succumbed to like accepting the nation state as their paradigm, right? That's probably why.
That's one. There's multiple reasons as to why the Islamists have not been able to see anything beyond the nation state or have come to accommodate the nation state. One of the reasons is that they didn't have a sustained systemic framework through which they can see the world, through which they can assess and say, okay, what are the rules of engagement with the West and the modern state? And the only way to have a systemic, coherent framework, a way of seeing the world, is if you ground that framework in a worldview. And that's exactly what Sayyid Qutb was trying to do. That's exactly what Taqiyuddin and Nabhani did. And that's one of the things I was trying to do in the paper. By saying, look, if we want to engage with the West, and if we want to come to try to understand what are the rules of engagement at the level of policy, at the level of praxis with the modern state, the IMF and so forth, we need to go back to our fundamental framework, which is our worldview. We have to begin at the level of the worldview with these ideas, Jahiliyyah, Hakimiyyah.
Is that your intention? Why you talked about Jahiliyyah? Even though
it's
so
not
that was
theoretical.
Okay.
Of course, it's never. One thing I strongly dislike is this division between intellectual endeavors and academia on one hand and politics on another. I believe that they have to inform one another. So my intention, and that's what I said in the introduction to the paper, of introducing Jahiliyyah is essentially to introduce a framework through which not only do we come to understand the modern order which we live under, but also determine what are the rules of engagement.
Okay.
Are we looking at radical change, or are we looking at incremental change and reform? Are we looking at accommodation and appropriation, just Islamicizing certain ideas? Or are we looking at something far more fundamental and intellectually daring and bold?
Yeah, I think one very disheartening thing from the example that you were mentioning is that you said, I think it's a step before the scenario that you painted of saying that who said that this can't collapse. I think it's I think it goes a little deeper than that. I think that one camp believes that if this doesn't work out, if we collapse because of us, the whole world is screwed.
Mm-hmm.
if it's not us, then no one else is going to succeed. That's actually very arrogant, right?
Exactly.
They think that if it's not us, if we're going to collapse, then the whole world is finished.
And
right?
that's exactly the
But that's the
Jahili.
mindset.
Exactly.
That's the mindset of the Muslims that are saying that this is not possible. Sharia is not possible. Because they've actually embodied that. It became very visceral to them that, hey, if America is the pinnacle of human achievement, and the West, I should say, and if they don't succeed, if we have any success, it's going to be through this vehicle right here. It can't be any other. Well, and the problem is that this brainwashing is so severe that it's creeped into, it's creeped all the way into Muslim people who are specialists on very high levels in Islamic universities, scholars themselves who have mass followings, is that we are very defeated. And this is the very test of Islam.
Yes.
Right? No matter how glamorous that these things become to you and how beautiful and how much you embody them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I'll give you an example. I mean, this is a public video. I still remember the video that a lot of people were talking about. It may have been like 6 years ago. Nouman Ali Khan, he was talking about politics, and he was mentioning that people, they just want to talk about, oh, we want Islam, we want Islam, we want Sharia, we want Sharia. And it was a brief moment which made me understand that many people are going to be misinformed based on that video. What he said was, the government is the biggest corporation in the world. It's the most complicated corporation. He's right. That part is all right. It's essentially one giant corporation, right? Mm. And he said all these people are saying we want Sharia because he used to be, his teacher was from Tanzim Islami, right? Yeah. Dr. Isar Ahmed, rahimahullah. So he knows what the movements are about. He knows what bringing about the Khilafah for many, many movements are about. So he was saying that people that just say we want Islamic State, we want a Khilafah, we want all this. But did anyone ever ask the question, what are you going to do about, for instance, you need to have people that are well versed in, for instance, sewage, or he said something like that. Something that was like, if the layperson sees it, they're like, oh, right, how many of these people who are calling to Islam are actually thinking about all these different elements and facets in government? Yeah. But people have, that's not the understanding. The understanding is that those people remain there. Yeah. It's not like the people who are trying to bring about Islam, okay, now we have to have people who are sanitarial engineers. Yes, we have to have people that are cleaning the streets. We're going to have people that are police. That's not what they're claiming. They're claiming that everything is going to stay as is on that level. You're just going to have the ruling party that has a different idea. Yeah. You understand what I'm saying?
I mean, look, the brother, they're not familiar with statecraft, right?
Yeah.
Statecraft.
No, and I'm not blaming him. I'm just saying that clip could be very misunderstood because people came to me and said, look what he's saying. He's a scholar and this and that.
It reminds me of just that same episode with Shadi where we were talking about the weakness in the thoughts of the movements, right? Like for whether it's Hizb ut-Tahrir or Ikhwan or Tanzim or whoever, it seems like the foot soldiers of the movements do so much damage by not being very well informed about the ideas that they're supposedly representing. So the people who are, in college campuses or who are young guys in their 18, 19-year-old, I was one of them. That's why I'm saying I'll put myself out there first. I said a lot of stuff that was completely incorrect, just based on ignorance. And I feel like a lot of the movements are doing themselves injustice by putting some of their younger students out there and perpetuating misinformation and getting them to debate with, people who they have no business debating with, or because they end up being the example that person ends up using. Like, hey, look, I debated this one guy from Ikhwan. Didn't know what he was talking about. He couldn't even explain to me the first things about government or anything, So they end up being used as a way to show, even though I feel like that's intellectual dishonesty.
Definitely. And I mean, there is some truth to there's a lot of truth to this idea that we are facing an intellectual crisis. And for example, what you noted, that many of these Muslim activists and these Muslim youth have done more damage than good. One of the ways in which they've done more damage than good is that they've like we said, only legitimize and reinforce, the prevailing modern order. But the question I think we need to ask is, okay, what are the origins of this intellectual crisis? Why is it that Islamists have not been able to properly articulate a roadmap? And I think one of the things that we try to allude to in the paper, and in the paper on Al-Hakimiyyah, is the origins of this intellectual crisis. Our inability to come up with a roadmap is because of our inability to understand and to appreciate that any political vision, your political horizons, are essentially grounded and based on your own worldview, on your first principles. So long as we treat the aqidah or our worldview as a theoretical abstraction, something that belongs to the books of Ilm al-Aqidah, we're not going to be able to understand the aqidah as a way of seeing the world, and subsequently coming up with a political vision, political horizons that go beyond those of modernity, and then subsequently, on the basis of the aqidah and that vision, charting our own course of action, a course of action which lays beyond the constraints of the modern world.
Right.
And just to build upon this point, in the consequence of us not articulating that vision grounded in aqidah is essentially living perpetually under this arrogant gaze of the modern man, right? Which is very similar to the gaze of Pharaoh, right? Where when Pharaoh declared, I am your Lord, the Most High. And for Pharaoh, anything beyond me is corruption. That's why he attacked Musa on the grounds that he wants to change your religion, and this will result in corruption being spread through the land.
Yeah.
So one of the characteristics of Jahiliyyah and the Jahili societies in the Quran has always been this idea that we are the ultimate referent, and anything beyond us is corruption, anything beyond us is disorder. And this is encapsulated so clearly in this end of history thesis, where the modern man was able to come and say with this audacity and boldness that, look, beyond the liberal order, there is nothingness, there is chaos. And that's why, if we look at popular culture, there is no, like for example, in movies in Hollywood, there is no conception of a post-liberal order. There's only zombies and apocalypse and cataclysmic tornadoes and whatnot. The modern man cannot even conceive of a world beyond that of modernity and of capitalism.
That's very interesting.
And so it becomes all the more problematic when the Muslim cannot look beyond the gaze of Jahiliyyah. When we become prisoners of this Jahili worldview, or this Jahili political horizon. And again, to emphasize, if there's any point I want to drive, it's that the only way we can escape that Jahili horizon, that colonial horizon, and the arrogance of modern man, is if we ground our vision in the Islamic aqidah, in the Islamic worldview.
So, okay, now if you let's say you understand that, like let's say somebody comes to your conclusion, mindset wise, but then they want to take a pragmatic step. A lot of times, because I don't think you'll find a lot of practicing Muslims. If you ask them, would you want to live under like an Islamic governance? Mm-hmm. They wouldn't say no, but they're like, listen, the practicality is that, like, we're having problem even getting people to pray, like doing basic stuff, right? So isn't there a priority? Even the whole, like, from my Salafi background was the concept of like focusing on the governance is kind of like backwards, because you focus on getting people to do the basics first, and then the idea that that governance side of things will just work itself out. And then they would argue that the caliphate fell because the Muslims just got too much in the dunya, and the caliphate just got taken away from Allah by Allah.
There's actually a very important point, and if this can be untied, this will clarify a lot of confusion for the people. But yeah, go ahead.
So the question that you're asking has been like a decades-old question about, is there a particular method, for reviving the deen, and where do we put our priorities, and are Muslims ready for a Islamic state, and so forth. It's a very nuanced question. It's a multifaceted question. I think one of the problems is that the way we've been framing the discussion is in somewhat of a negative and a fatalistic outlook, right? As though we're trapped within the confines of modernity, and that Muslims are somehow always in a state of lacking and immaturity, and they haven't reached the pinnacle of Islamic maturity. I would
add to that the frame is also poisoned by people's view of what an Islamic governance system looks like. Because their image of it is just, of Saudi Arabia, or Iran, all these women just walking around in burqas, and there's no it's a very monolith society.
Exactly. And yes, I mean, in addition to the fact that we frame it in this lens, this somewhat pessimistic and fatalist lens, another problem is, okay, what is Islamic governance? More than often we see it as some kind of utopia, some kind of end goal, which is very much aligned with this idea of the modern state, as being the ultimate manifestation of man's maturity and reason. And Islam, the Islamic state, Islamic governance has always been a means to an end, like a means through which certain components of Sharia come to dominate public life and come to cultivate and culture the individual and the subject and relations and so forth. So the first thing is we need to, I think, go beyond this more pessimistic and fatalistic frame in relation to how we understand the condition of the Muslim world today and the realm of possibilities that are, within our hands, within our reach. And secondly, understanding the Khilafah not and the Islamic State not as some sort of utopia or some kind of, dream, on like a rescinding horizon, but very much as a means towards an end, a means towards gaining autonomy in global public affairs, a way through which the Muslims can assert a global Islamic voice in international politics, a way in which Sharia is no longer a tradition that exists in, the classical texts on jurisprudence, but it becomes very much a lived reality that has something to say about what's going on in the world. And the Islamic State as a stepping stone towards cultivating and resuming the Islamic way of life in its fullest form.
Right. Yeah, and it's very simply put, this is one thing, like, even to explain to children. So let me just reiterate, because I think this is very, very important. So I've heard this statement before. Okay, you come to a conclusion, that everything and all sovereignty belongs to Allah. And Muhammad ﷺ showed us the best way of how to do it, because Allah gave him that wahi. So someone will say, okay, now you have to have an Islamic state of mind before you have an Islamic state, right?
You establish the caliphate in your hearts before the caliphate.
I've heard that before too.
Right.
But the reason why that's a misconception, very simply put, is whatever governs us, that's what controls our hearts. Why do you hate littering?
I don't.
Because why do people hate littering? Why do they recycle, right? Because it's institutions that made them believe, and it became repetitive until they wouldn't have it any other way. When I was in Egypt, and I'd be walking with a bunch of brothers from America or whatever, and they would see somebody throwing garbage, they'd be like, oh man, that's so...
What is this, yeah.
Because even though they don't like littering, but they've grown up around it so much, right? And that's something that's very visceral. That's something that's from inside, that comes from almost like your fitrah. So, the Arabs used to say, "An-nasu ala dini mulukihim," right? Basically, people are on the religion of the people that rule over them, or we're a product of our environment, right? The reason why I think that's a flawed analogy is because nobody's saying that if, in order to establish Islam, everyone has to be on the same Iman wavelength, or everyone has to be... No, you're not. That's never going to happen.
The Khulafa wouldn't have captured the countries surrounding them, the Iran, North Africa.
Exactly.
They were all ruled...
Majority were all non-Muslim, right? So the thing is that the reason why it's very... the reason why I want to focus on this is what pushes people away from understanding the holisticness of true Islam, is they think that everyone has to have Iman, and then Imam Mahdi is going to come, and that's it. We're game. No, that's not what it is. Even if you never get a chance to attain a true way of life of Islam or Islamic State, right? True Islamic State, not the fake Islamic State that exists right now. Even if it never happens, this is the dilemma. It's not like, okay, how many years? That's the wrong question to ask. It is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created man to establish Allah's deen in this dunya. And even if it never happens, it doesn't matter. We have to die as believers and having some part in raising awareness of all sovereignty belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that's very deceptive and misleading, is that if you're not going to have it and we're never going to have it, then don't even try. It's such a defeated way of, like, we'll be so driven about our careers, we're so driven about raising our kids, but when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like, you'll ask somebody, don't you want the pleasure of Allah? Any child, you ask them, right? Who's raised on Islam, basically. What's the maximum that you want to have the pleasure of Allah. You know, I want to do salah, zakat, so have money. If I'm able to, I'll do hajj. Okay, but what else? Wouldn't you want your dealings as far as money, right, to be distributed according to what Allah wants? Don't you want to deal every contract you make? Okay, don't you want to get married the way Rasul says? Don't you want to, even if you have to divorce, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ut-Tahrir bil ihsan. Even at such a time of so much stress and warfare amongst people, you still have to do ihsan, letting somebody go, right? All of these things, buying, selling, everything has to be done. But guess what? 80% of Islam is all theoretical right now. And it can't be done without actually somebody or through a sovereign entity, right? Even, I mean, we could talk about this, you know, but even zakat, how do we actually know that our zakat is actually distributed Islamically? In Islam, one of the conditions of zakat actually being zakat is it has to be done by a sovereign entity. You and me just give it individually.
Yeah, right.
This is what we refer to as like emergency mode. Everything we do right now is emergency mode.
State of exception.
Yeah, but it's like emergency. Okay, you know what? We don't have a sovereign entity that's going to distribute it for the ummah, so we're all just going to do it individually, right? So the reason why I'm kind of passionate about this is it leads to misunderstanding fiqh also, right? And it leads to misunderstanding Allah's deen, and it leads to belittling the Sharia. We could talk highly of it in an emotional state, but when it comes down to practicality, we're like, oh, dude, there's no way it's going to happen in 2018 or 2020. Somehow we're going to have this, you know, Islamic governance or Islamic entity. There's no way, dude. We got the West now. It's that those days are over.
So, okay, Ali, I got to ask you a couple of questions. Obviously, we mentioned in the intro that you're not shy about your allegiance with Hizb ut-Tahrir, and
pull it more towards you.
You know, you're not shy about your allegiance with Hizb ut-Tahrir. So, you know, I think it's fair game because obviously there's people that have misconceptions based upon like what Sim was alluding to. Sometimes these groups will put not their best people forward and, you know, cause a bad name. So some people think when they think about Hizb ut-Tahrir, they think about an organization that they only hear about every 4 years in America because they're out there outside of Juma protesting, telling brothers not to like vote for the election, right? The presidential election. And then they disappear. Let me ask you this. Obviously, every guy from Hizb I've ever spoken to lives in America says, we're not trying to establish caliphate in America. I'm like, okay, someone's got a brain because Muslims are only 1%. It's not going to like happen. It's not like and I'm like, we want to do it. Our mission is to do it in Muslim lands. Is that correct, right?
Correct.
Okay. With that being said, then why don't you think it's wasted energy to think about like what other Muslims are going to do as far as voting in America?
I think that's an excellent question. First and foremost,
it's
a very good question, and I'm glad you raised that issue. To answer the question, the party is a global political party, and it acts globally, and all of its members are integrated into a global vision.
Sure.
So what Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example, seeks in Pakistan or in Syria is very much aligned with the actions and the activities of the Hizb in the United States and in the UK. It's all integrated, right? And this is one of the reasons that the party has never been domesticated, right? You've never had like a domesticated US party branch and a domesticated UK that tailors, you know, to the needs of the United Kingdom and so forth. So that's to answer your question. Why is it that we
for the message to be consistent, basically?
Exactly. So for the message to be consistent and for us to maintain the global nature of our vision and the global nature of the party's action, the party has to act in a global integrated way, where we can't divorce our activities in the United States from our activities in Pakistan. One of the reasons this is so important is because the Muslim mind around the world has become domesticated. So Muslims in America see themselves as American Muslims, and their political horizons are limited to the United States. So then when you begin to talk to them about ideas such as Islamic revival, they'll tell you, okay, but I'm a minority. I'm a minority in the United States. Well, what the party is saying is that no, you're not a minority. You're part of a global majority. You're part of a global ummah. So that's the message that we constantly try to repeat to Muslims living in the West. And then when it comes to, for example, the issue of voting, the message is essentially this: we can't compromise the ummah's global interests and global vision for the sake of local, immediate, short-term interests. We have to be part of this global vision. And in my opinion, that's actually a product, and that's one of the fruits of adopting and internalizing the Islamic Aqidah, that it is a global message, it is a global movement. It is a global project that cannot be constrained by the interests of a particular nation or a community. And so, in regards to, the brothers coming and disappearing and whatnot, I mean, that might be a local issue. The party might lack presence in certain cities and whatnot, but the party currently operates in more than 54 countries. We hold massive rallies across the Muslim world, from Palestine to Beirut to Syria.
And when you're rallying, for instance, some people are generally, whether you're Muslim or not, are pro rallies and not pro rallies. So in your rally, what's making it different than everybody else's rally? Like, if Hizb ut-Tahrir is having a rally, what is usually the message? Is it, what are you raising awareness for? Or do you want something to stop? Like, stop doing this, stop doing that. Is that what it?
So, I mean, it depends, of course. In our reading of the prophetic method, our reading of the seerah, we believe that there's different components to establishing the caliphate. One of which is an intellectual struggle, where you try to counter false un-Islamic ideas and then build Islamic ideas that are grounded in the Islamic Aqidah. That's one. Two, political struggle. So sometimes we might rally against certain individuals, certain coalitions. For example, our protests currently in Syria, trying to raise awareness about the detrimental effect of aligning with regional powers. And
so you're going directly to the people, to Syria itself. Like, do you ever go to, for instance, I'm just curious, would Hizb ut-Tahrir ever go to, Washington and say, you know what, hey, intervene with Syria and stop the bloodshed that's happening in Syria?
That's a good question, and I'm glad you asked that, because actually that's a misconception about Hizb ut-Tahrir. This idea that we try to seek nusra or aid from non-Islamic and un-Islamic entities. That's most certainly not true. The Hizb would not ask the United States to intervene. If anything, the Hizb, since its inception, has been arguing and trying to raise awareness among Muslims that Western intervention is it's a ploy. It's all a big theatrical game, basically, and that the only reason the United States or any Western power would intervene in the Muslim world is to secure its own interests, to try to appropriate certain political actors. And nowhere is this more evident than the Arab Spring. Very early in 2011, 2012, when the uprisings began in Egypt, the party was very consistent, saying, listen, you cannot try to broker a deal with Washington when it comes to the Egyptian revolution. You're essentially digging your own grave. So we were very much against Western intervention. No,
the reason I'm asking, I can respect that a lot, because one thing is that if you're really concerned about the Muslims, you're going to go to the Muslims themselves and say, hey, wake up. And you're not going to have someone else do your work for you.
That's the problem is that, I was talking to a Syrian brother on Facebook, and he was saying that, you know what, yeah, it might be a ploy, it might be whatever, it might be securing their interests, but people are dying right now. I have relatives there, and they're hurting, and whether they have their interests or not, of course it's going to be in their interest to, whenever they get involved in an overseas action, right? So right now, we just need to stop the bloodshed. What's wrong with that?
I mean, okay, so historically speaking, interventions have never been solutions. Western interventions have never been solutions for long-term stability and security. If anything, they've only perpetuated instability, chaos, and these authoritarian, draconian regimes. So if we're looking for long-term solutions, or even not even long-term solutions, just something within our immediate horizon in terms of ending this instability, right, and these authoritarian regimes, which is why the Muslim world revolted to begin with.
Right.
Then we need something beyond quick fixes, which is Western intervention.
But so, like Shadi Hamid, we were on his podcast, he said, America intervened in Bosnia and Kosovo, and they stopped the bloodshed there. Well, I mean, what's wrong with that? Why not get the Americans involved? And sometimes it might lead to good things. It doesn't always have to be that, their actions will lead to further chaos.
Again, so I think here this is an issue of priorities and vision. Right? If your priority and if your ultimate objective is to find systemic solutions, long-term and mid-term solutions for the violence, for the instability, and for the chaos, not to mention the poverty and so forth, and regional mingling in domestic affairs. If you want a solution, systemic solution for those issues, then we're going to have to start looking beyond Western intervention.
You're saying that Muslims need to have agency. They need to have...
Muslims need to have agency, and agency begins with vision. Agency begins with their ability to think beyond the quote-unquote helping hand of the United States.
And the reason why, unfortunately, Muslims have to go to the level of asking Western powers is there's nobody in neighboring countries that are all Muslims that are going to help them, right?
Yeah.
So can you blame them for doing it? You understand why. But if you're looking at like what you're painting, a grand vision, that would be counterintuitive, right? But what I see is that it's the fault of Muslims themselves and the individuals who are shepherds of these nations, these split up nations that are supposed to be, taking care of their brothers. Mm-hmm. So they have given up all hope in them, and they're in an emergency situation. Let's just Hail Mary throw to make sure.
Exactly. But shouldn't we like still focus on because maybe the grand vision means we gotta lose more lives up front.
No, I mean, look, it's a vicious circle. We have to think of it in that. First of all, we need to approach the topic, this issue, for example, the issue of the massacres and genocides, in a holistic way, in a global way, right? Look at all the the elements involved, and also from an Islamic lens. Otherwise, we're falling into like a vicious circle. So that circle being genocides occur because we don't have agency. We don't have agency because we accept the constraints and the intervention of Western powers, and they do that because we don't have agency. Therefore, the genocides continue. Right. So we're just perpetuating this cycle. It's not going to end until we take a step back. We're like, okay, look, now we have to stop talking about these quick pragmatic fixes, or catering to Obama or Bush or Clinton or NATO and whatnot, and begin to think on the level of systemic solutions, thinking on the level of regional and global solutions. And again, to emphasize, that begins with vision, and vision begins with intellectual autonomy, which can only occur, it can only come to fruition when we begin to see the world from the lens of our own aqidah.
Yeah, and I was telling this to Sim maybe a few months ago, and I said the reason why, without looking at the individuals themselves, right? Mm-hmm. This is what's key, is what is this movement, whether you just want to research movements, what is it offering me of any benefit? And one thing that you'll realize itself with the Hizb, as far as Hizb ut-Tahrir is concerned, it's the only group that I know of that tells you, hey, listen, we're this party, this is our goal, but it doesn't stop there. This is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3. Unfortunately, with all the other movements, maybe I'm wrong, but from my limited research and from what I understand, there's not a step-by-step process, and there's not a goal. The Hizb ut-Tahrir said this is the goal. Establishing Allah's deen on this earth is a goal, and this is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3. That's the main reason why I respect the party.
Yeah, that's why Ikhwan actually fell. This is why the Muslim Brotherhood.
They had awesome figures. Hassan al-Banna, rahimahullah, may Allah give him Jannah without any hisab. Sayyid Qutb also. But there was not, the end goal was talked about, but there was not a step-by-step process. Okay, if we're living here, this is how it's going to be. Which is going to answer your question. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think Hizb ut-Tahrir, when you're not living in an area where you are going to establish Islam. So any of the listeners, please don't be worried. No Muslim is here to establish any type of Islamic state in America. It's not a goal of any group, right? But that being said, if you're living in America, and since you're not establishing it there, your goal is to raise awareness and tell Muslims of what the Khilafah actually is and how you can help people that are trying to establish Islam by peaceful means. Yes, right? Hizb ut-Tahrir, that's one thing that people don't understand about Hizb ut-Tahrir also. Hizb ut-Tahrir had never believed to take up arms.
Yes.
Right? It's not a terrorist group like some people say. It has nothing to do with arms. Everything has to do with peaceful struggle. Because of, we can have a whole podcast with you about that later.
But now there's one thing that, you're saying that's all fine and dandy, but one thing that Ali was mentioning is that you're obviously talking about the whole concept of being an American Muslim is kind of like to Hizb, that's like a foreign concept. We're part of the global ummah, which is fine and dandy. But, why don't we have, a lot of you guys, maybe his brothers were, born in America. But, why don't you, put your money where your mouth is and give up your citizenship then?
I don't think it has to do with giving out citizenship.
Yeah, no,
why not?
It has nothing to do with citizenship.
Okay.
I think that's a misconception.
Like, cause it sounds like it's very like anti-American in that way. Like, I'm not gonna participate in anything that'll make this country better. So, like, you know what I'm saying?
But first, just you can add on to this. But first and foremost, we have to clarify if somebody has a national passport, right?
Right.
Does that? Who said that in order for me to have a booklet or a piece of paper stamped that I was born in this land, right? Mm-hmm. What is the rules of engagement to say that I am a good citizen or a bad citizen? First and foremost. Mm-hmm. If I don't, it's actually a freedom not to vote, right? That's a freedom, right? I exercise my right not. So let's just say somebody says that, right? But you're still working within the framework of the Constitution. But do I have to uphold the Constitution and every single thing in my life in order for me to be an American or just hold a booklet? That has nothing to do with it. That's another thing that, and I'm not saying this is your idea. I know you're playing devil's advocate for the most part, but some people think, hey, if it's that idea and it's a sense of arrogance. Well, if you don't like it, then leave, right? That's a very colonized way of thinking. And the colonial power usually thought the slave to think in that way. If you don't like this, then go to the other, plantation. Right. And it's an embedded racism that we don't think about, is that when you tell someone, if you don't like it, go somewhere else, that's an embedded racism.
Well, the same people who are saying that or have said that in the past now get upset when the Trump supporters say that to them. Like, hey, well, if you don't like this country,
who's right then? That's an awesome point. Who's right?
And it was the same people who would say that when I was part of Islamic movements, they would say that to me, like, well, if you don't like it, you don't leave. And now they're the ones who are getting that same response.
They're getting the same response. They are. But yeah, I lost my train of thought.
No, because it's because like I'm asking these questions because this is like
I know that
my background is like I'm basically flushing out every question right now.
Okay, so
right?
so to answer the question briefly, I think also we need to take a step back and ask the question, which I think the brother alluded to, is who dictates what I can or cannot do in a particular territory? So is it the sovereign state, right? Which, as I tried to argue, is that you cannot have any sovereignty beyond Allah Azza wa Jal, or does Allah Azza wa Jal dictate what I say or cannot say in any land in which I reside? So my obligations to Allah Azza wa Jal supersede my obligations, the so-called rights and obligations that a particular state arbitrarily defines for me. So that's the first thing, that we're Muslim before, we're arbitrarily American or Italian or Lebanese and so forth. That's the first thing. Second thing is, the party is very clear on this issue that when you live under a particular territory, there's a covenant that you have to preserve. Fiqh al-aqliyyah, the fiqh of minorities, although that's been misused, this term, in the past few decades. But essentially what that is in Islamic jurisprudence is that so long as they haven't violated their oath with you, then you have to preserve their honor, their wealth, their blood, and so forth. So adopting this global vision and being part of a global ummah, and recognizing the sovereignty of Allah Azza wa Jal as being as superseding that of the U.S. Constitution and the so-called natural rights and the Bill of Rights and so forth, that does not mean that you have to completely withdraw from society or take up arms against society.
Yeah.
Because you still have obligations towards your neighbors, which are grounded in your obligations to God, your obligations to Allah Azza wa Jal. And even within the party's method, we believe that part of the methodology that the Prophet adopted was to adopt the interests of the community, to uphold these interests. And so this applies to Muslims globally, but this also applies to Muslims in certain localities. So, for example, in our last conference in Chicago, or I believe it was in Illinois, we took up the issue of the assault on the Muslim mind among Muslims in America. So we were addressing something within the United States that Muslims were facing. Mass surveillance, this attempt to secularize Islam, this idea of the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, and so forth. So being part of this global Islamic alternative and this global vision and thinking like a global Muslim doesn't negate your communal
because it's crossing of two things, right? Mm-hmm. It's crossing of wires. What is being discussed here is you have an aqidah obligation to Allah, right, and you have a bodily obligation to Allah, and you have the obligation to people, right? The obligation to people, Muslims should be at the highest level of your obligation to people, especially your neighbors, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim. That doesn't matter. right? So that's one thing. So you're going to be the best citizen, if you want to say, on that level, as far as wherever you go, whether you're living under a Buddhist entity, right? Whether you're living in Tibet, whether wherever you're living. And then this other, as far as what's related to my creed and belief, I can live under a Buddhist entity as long as they don't make me or force me to bow down to something.
Yeah.
Right? But other than that, even though those people are going to be against me physically, I still have to be nice to them because they have rights over me as somebody who is a believer, somebody who's maybe even their neighbor, right? And when somebody's your neighbor, it doesn't really matter what religion they're. You're still going to have to be. So so when people say, again, coming back to, since you're living in the society, it doesn't make sense for you to live in the society if you have these beliefs. No, the beautiful thing about this belief system is I can raise awareness. And I always tell people who talk about freedom of speech and freedom of having the right. If you're saying I have freedom of speech and I have the right to believe whatever I want, I'm not imposing anything on you. I just choose to do less of what you're doing. That's all I'm doing.
Okay.
Right? I'm not just, my engagement is now the criterion.
And you're not breaking any laws.
I'm not breaking any laws.
Right.
I have to abide by laws.
Sure.
Right? I have to abide by all laws. Right? As long as they don't, go against and contradict Islam directly, and there's not really any laws that are going to make you do that or put a gun to your head. But so why do you have a dilemma if I'm not voting? Why do you have a dilemma if I don't like Democrats or Republicans? Why do I have to choose or like them? Why do I have to why is that even your business? Am I a nice person to you? Am I harming you? No, then who cares? Right. If you ask me to watch your kids, I'd watch them just like you would.
And it's a funny thing is that if any other American said that, it would be perfectly fine. I know I have coworkers who have completely lost faith in the American system. They don't feel like the Democrats represent them. They don't feel like the Republicans represent them. They feel like their government's been bought out by corporate interests, by the military-industrial complex, and they've lost faith. And when they say it, it's completely fine. Because they're true Americans. They're the white Americans who have that right to say, but we, because of our brothers overseas, they did some naughty things that they
it comes from an inferiority complex.
Are you saying that
it comes from a place of inferiority?
Are you saying the Mad Mamluks now believe in white privilege?
No, I'm just saying, there are people in our own community who say that, who actually give white privilege. They're saying they have that right. They can say it, but we brown folks can't say it.
Yeah, it's the same people. Slave mindset. It's a colonized mindset. That's what that is.
I want to ask Ali one more question because I've been smelling buffalo wings for the past 40 minutes, and it's man, I'm about to break. But one more question. I've got to unlook. So
why have you been smelling buffalo wings? I don't get it.
We have buffalo wings right here. Bro.
Oh, that's what you mean. Okay.
Yeah,
I just thought you smelled buffalo wings.
No. I wish I could just automatically just channel whatever smell. I know you want to channel the smell of what's that? Kushari?
Kushari from Egypt.
Yeah, but Sure. So one of the if you're an average Muslim, people gravitate towards groups, right? People that's why people Salafi or Sufi or whatever. Some Muslims I just want to be Muslim, but sometimes people like groups and they look for figureheads or credibility. The Salafis, their scholars are pretty well known history, last 100 years. Sheikh bin Baz, Al-Albani, the Sufis, have their world renowned ulama. Who does Hizb have? Because people will say Hizb, they don't have ulama background. They're a bunch of activists who don't know how to interpret the texts, and therefore they got this whacked out understanding of the deen.
Okay, so very important point to make, before I proceed, is that the party is not a school of thought. It's not a madhab.
Right.
In the same way you have, for example, the Shafi'is, the Hanafis, and then you don't have the Tahriris. So the party is not, the party is not a jurisprudential school of thought, that produces legal rulings on marriage and what have you. It is a political party, and this political party includes Muslims from different madhahib, of course, those legitimate madhahib, that coalesce around a particular religious obligation, hukum shari, which is establishing the khilafah, and doing so through the ahkam which have been delineated for us in the Quran and for the Sunnah. As for do we have scholars, the Hizb has many scholars, alhamdulillah, across the Muslim world. In Beirut, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Palestine.
Are they scholars that actually graduated from recognized institutions like Medina or Al-Azhar or
studied with like
because what I've always heard from people, mainstream scholars, like, oh, their scholars are like, they usually point at like Ayman al-Zawahiri. He never had anyone who he could say is well known, who was his teacher, and there's no like lineage or what's that thing? Isnad of teachers. Is that a fair criticism, or are the scholars that are part of Hizb ut-Tahrir well known in are they people who graduated from well known institutions?
Just give you an example from where I was in Beirut. Many of our senior members actually graduated from these Islamic universities.
Yeah.
Whether it's local university, the Beirut Islamic University, or they had studied, for example, within some of the institutions in Pakistan or in Azhar.
Yeah.
The issue is this, right? The issue is that we don't build a party around personalities.
Yeah.
We don't build a party around certain figureheads, and we don't engage in personality branding.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why it might seem as though, there's some reclusive figures or there's lack of scholars. The fact of the matter is that what the party is interested in is in terms of branding and shedding light on certain ideas and not certain figures.
Yeah.
And I think that's the main issue. And I think many of the
times... Do
you
think that hurts the party, though? Because I think human beings want to follow figures. They always want some kind of modern manifestation of the Prophet Sallallahu
And of course, that's normal. That's part of our human condition. And the party.
But do you think that hurts the party?
It definitely does hurt the party in terms of in terms of image and branding and public relations. But I think in terms of what we're gaining.
Yeah.
What we're gaining in hand in terms of propagating a certain set of ideas and a certain set of scholarship instead of personalities. I think in the long term, we have much more to gain from that.
Though. It's much more difficult.
There's something that I just realized.
Something that's a huge characteristic about this party, I'm beginning to realize, is that you guys refuse pragmatism, like to its core.
It's a principle. It's
very principlist.
It's a matter
party.
of principle, and again, that's why.
That's why people think. Pardon my language. People think you're crazy because you're too principle based.
Well, at the end of the day,
I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
Yeah,
well, the Prophet Sallallahu
Allah Azza wa Jal created us to live and die for a particular principle.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's what's at stake. What's at stake is the life and death of an idea, and not the life and death of a particular personality. To give you an example, the Amir of Hizb ut-Tahrir,
yes,
right, is by all means, if you were to look at his work, he has written works on tafsir, usul fiqh, and others, and produced many fatawa which illustrate his intellectual caliber and scholarship and understanding of
Are you talking about the founder?
No, not Sheikh Taqiyuddin Nabhani,
and
who was a mujtahid in and of himself. Same thing with Sheikh Abdul Qayyim, but the current Amir.
And Sheikh Taqiyuddin Nabhani, was he part of the tariqa of his father was like part of a Sufi tariqa?
His grandfather was Yusuf al-Nabhani, yes. Yeah. But he was Azhar, he graduated from Al-Azhar and he was a Qadi in Palestine. So even our current Amir, for example, even though he does qualify as a scholar and he has written remarkably, scholarly and in-depth works on usul, you don't find the party propagating or trying to advertise him. And again, it's a matter of principle.
But not only that, you haven't fallen into the model of using someone or personality to market your idea. I think that's kind of a capitalist way of branding something, right? You have to have a figure, a face, and then from that you're going to get the followers, the people to accept it.
I think.
Do you understand what I'm saying? I think that they're trying to fight that whole way of going about.
Is the Amir though do other ulama, like let's say, because like when you have high level ulama, even regardless of ideology, other ulama real recognize real, right?
Yeah, but let me just.
You know
brother, you can ask the same thing about, do scholars from Medina recognize the scholars of Azhar? They don't. Many of them don't. They will call into question their credibility. They'll call into question their qualifications and so forth.
Yeah, didn't we have didn't we have a phone call about that?
No, yeah, but I mean, at some level there is.
Question, you know what I mean?
But like, if you think about, like, for example, like Yusuf Qaradawi recognizes Taqi Osmani, who recognizes Abdullah bin Baya, right? Or like Sheikh Muhammad.
There's a few reasons. I know where you're getting.
You know what I'm saying?
There's a few reasons. The problem is that in many
like Sheikh Hassan Didu, right?
Yeah.
Everyone recognizes Sheikh Didu, no matter if they're Sufi, Salafi, Ikhwan, whatever.
But the problem is the
right?
stigma that's there in the Muslim world with Hizb ut-Tahrir, in all fairness, right?
Yeah.
Is that if you're a part of a Hizb ut-Tahrir, whichever country you're living in, a majority of Muslim countries, it's over for you, right? It's at least in the late 90s to early 2000s. I don't know how it is now. Even now, it's creeping with the Brotherhood, right? The Brotherhood with the help of Saudi. We'll get into all that later. But this is one thing that we're not understanding is people from Hizb ut-Tahrir are human beings just like you and I, right? We may not be members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, but there are people that are members in society that people may not know. We even know some people, or I know some people that were students of Sheikh Ramadan al-Bouti that were from the Hizb. They learned fiqh and they have ijazah from him, whatever disciplines. They learned fiqh from him, but they were still a part of a movement, right?
Yeah.
So you have people that are scattered all over the world that have studied traditional knowledge with people, right? And they're just maybe not, their name is not known, but they still have traditional knowledge just like most people would. You know what I'm saying? So we're trying to make it as if, I'm sorry to cut you off, we're trying to make it as if these people, because they're calling for something special, they have to have superhuman qualities. No, they're human just like everybody else. Just like everybody else, every other group, you know, Ikhwan has scholars, Jamaat Tabligh has scholars, these people have scholars, Hizb ut-Tahrir has scholars too, right? The dilemma here with people not understanding is they're very, very keen. Hizb ut-Tahrir is very, very keen on not promoting people and personalities. So, and there's many benefits, I think, in that too, you know, and I agree for the most part on that, you know, that you can't have a central personality that everything revolves around. Then it comes back to, I think that's why you were alluding to, we have to make sure the method or the way that somebody's conducting something that fits under the lens of Islam, not the person himself from the beginning of the podcast.
Exactly,
right?
and that's one of the reasons. I mean, okay, so in terms of if one wants to assess the legitimacy of Hizb ut-Tahrir as an Islamic movement, the Quran and the Sunnah gives us very clear guidelines and parameters for how do we assess an idea or a movement, and that's essentially by taking it back and measuring it against the Deen, against the Quran and the Sunnah. Now, in that regards, if somebody wants to assess or try to come to understand and evaluate Hizb ut-Tahrir, then they can go back to Hizb ut-Tahrir's literature and the foundational text from which this movement emerged. So, for example, before the party even went about trying to tell Muslims this is the Islamic methodology for revival, they wrote a whole volume on usul al-fiqh, on the principles and the tools that we use to derive those rulings regarding the methodology.
Is that the reason for that? I never understood why that was.
Islamic Personality, Volume 3. Many people think that, okay, why would a political party write a book on legal theory?
Did you know about that?
I only read...
did you know that was a reason for that, though?
I only read up to Islamic Personality Volume 1. That was when...
No, but what he's saying is the motive behind that, to write about usul, was paving the way so people know why the methodology is the way it is.
Exactly. So we're basically
telling the
Muslims,
that's pretty impressive.
We're putting forth a 500-page, 450-page document saying, okay, look, this is the legal theory, and these are the tools, these are the usul that we use to produce the fiqh that we mention in regards to methodology in the khilafah and so forth. And then even when the party addresses issues such as intellectual revival and revival of ideas, before we even speak of Islamic ideas, you have books, a whole book written on what is thinking.
Okay,
what
well,
is the thought.
we have a lot of Islam nerds, or some Islam nerds that listen to us, meaning people who love, literature of Islam and usul. So
I would recommend Islamic Personality.
But I'm saying that what you said that there's a book of usul.
Yes.
Because in order for an establishment of any entity, you have to have an usul behind it.
Yes.
Right. So for the listeners, and just for myself, because I would love to do research, I love reading about usul fiqh. What book can we pick up just so we can know what step one of the mindset of the party is?
So you can begin with the first book, which is the System of Islam, Nizam al-Islam, by Taqiyuddin Nabhani, and that's actually where we begin to define what is an idea, what is an idea, how is an idea constituted, and what's the difference between an Islamic idea and a non-Islamic idea.
So this is all before usul.
Exactly, this is all before usul.
So this is just an idea itself.
Of course, because usul is a set of ideas. So before we define usul, which is a thought structure, we have to define what is an idea and how does an idea come into fruition.
Okay.
What is the process?
So first you have
System of Islam.
System of Islam, which is just talking about how to form an idea, what an idea is.
Ideas, what is a worldview, what is Islam as a deen.
Okay.
And then, of course, the Quran, the Sunnah, what are the ahkam al-shar'iyyah.
Okay.
What is a civilization.
And that's all in the first.
It's all the foundations,
okay.
Yes. And the idea here is to provide the grounder for an Islamic mode of thinking, an Islamic aqliyah.
Of course.
The second book I would recommend is Shakhsiyah Volume 1, Islamic Personality Volume 1,
Okay.
where we talk about worldviews
Okay.
and Islamic sciences in more depth.
And this is all before usul.
This is or before usul,
Okay.
of course. And then we have Shakhsiyah Al-Islamiyya Volume 3, Islamic Personality Volume 3, where we discuss usul, beginning from who is the hakim, what is the hukum, so what is the definition of a ruling, right? All the way to issues of al-masalih and al-mafasid and the states of exception and usul and so forth. Very comprehensive
Do you need
text.
to read volume 2? Or is
Volume
that one?
2 is more in relation to the jurisprudence of governance
Oh, okay.
in Islam.
It's probably like
And
one
then-
of those boring seasons that you skip over.
No,
when
no,
you're-
it's only
when you're
because
like-
we're
Not
talking
boring.
here about
Maybe-
No, I'm
we're
just
talking
saying,
here
like,
about usul.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Don't mind him. He's
and then we have a book, of course, called Thinking, Al-Tafkir, which essentially talks about ideology and how ideas are formed and how do you evaluate a good idea versus a bad idea or a false idea versus a true idea. So my point here is that the ideas or the party's vision, the party's discourse, the party's actions, and the things that party members are saying are not grounded in a particular personality. They're grounded in very structured, deep, systemic thought
okay. And
that has been produced and translated into volumes of work.
And I'm sorry to go back to this. So, but if I want to read the usul portion that we talked about, that is, you said Shakhsiyah Volume 3.
Yeah, the Islamic Personality Volume 3.
Islamic Personality
And you
Volume
can
3.
find it on the party
And
website.
based on that, everything is of why and how Hizb ut-Tahrir says what it says and why it
Exactly.
believes everything is from
Exactly.
the Sharia. Okay, cool. So no, that's just for my personal research too, because I want anything that has to do with fiqh, Rasul fiqh. I love reading it. So that's awesome. I didn't know that, to be honest with you.
Very cool. Well, Ali, I guess we're gonna wrap up pretty soon. How can people find out more about you? I know you're on Twitter. You found him on Twitter?
Yeah, I found him on Twitter. I sent out a tweet saying, equating Sayyid Qutb to ISIS is like saying the Beatles started black metal or death metal.
That's a good analogy.
And that's when he replied back and he said like, "Hey, check out this article I wrote," or something like that. There was some kind of engagement like that, and I was like, "Whoa, this is."
That's
great
actually how you guys
article.
met each other?
Yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah, I remember that tweet. That
That's
tweet wasn't that long ago, but
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming through because
It's
it's
my
been
pleasure.
very
Barakallahu feek for
informative.
having me.
I think our listeners will really enjoy this. This is like right up.
No, it clarified a lot of things for me,
Yeah.
man. You know, there's a lot of
Barakallahu feek.
misconceptions that I may have had about not only just Hizb ut-Tahrir itself, but just how we conduct ourselves, and
Yeah.
so jazakallah khairan, man.
وإياكم
It doesn't mean I'm going to join, but I probably won't
I don't
be a
think
hater
it's pointless
anymore.
to join.
Okay, that's good enough.
I won't be a hater anymore.
No, look, and I don't think any of the movements want you to join their group specifically.
They
Because
just don't want you to fall into traps. I think that's what
I
that
think-
is.
I think
it's
the-
all about like avoiding brainwashing.
Yeah.
Change your way of thinking.
Yeah, well, what
right?
I was like, I was talking to Daniel once, Daniel Hakikachu, and it's all about untangling the amalgamation of ideologies that are prevailing in society, and even studying the religion so long as we have, we realize like, oh wait, where did this idea come from? It's this constant engagement that you do with the text, with the religious text, where you're kind of always testing where your ideas are coming from. Because, I mean, as you learn in the first chapters of Hizb ut-Tahrir, you learn how your ideas kind of formulated and overlapped on top of each other, and how you came up with your concepts, and eventually your own consciousness. You kind of end up unraveling all that in the first paragraph of that book, if you really study it in
The
depth.
nature of the mind.
Yeah, the nature of the mind and human consciousness. And this is one of the things I always told the brothers from the Hizb, that this is the best thing that you have in your group, even more than the whole Khilafah idea. I don't want to get into the details about what's best and what's not, but you get the point. I'm trying to say that this is
very molecular.
It's a huge gem that you guys are carrying in what you guys have in your study sessions and in your circles, that you need to send out to the rest of the world. Like, this is something that many people are struggling with. They're trying to understand, like, why am I the way I am?
Yeah.
Why is the consciousness itself is such a huge discussion point in science right now, and in
it's a big buzzword
therapy,
now.
and everyone's trying to figure out what is this thing. And this is something that you're really learning from the first paragraph of their books. Why are you the way you are?
I do have a series on this topic on YouTube called An Introduction to the Islamic Aqidah. You can find it on my Twitter feed.
That's a 3-part series, right?
Yes, inshallah it's going to continue in fall, and the upcoming topic will actually be the issue of Jahili and Hakimiyyah, inshallah.
Would you say the first or the approach of Hizb ut-Tahrir is in line with the Ash'ari thought of how to approach the Aqidah? Because I've always thought that the Ash'aris were very logical in their terms of in how they approach the belief in the Creator, and then they kind of build on top of that building, and then once you believe in the Creator, that you believe in the books and the prophets and so on. Is that
I actually give you some homework for that. There's a whole chapter in Islamic Personality Volume 1 dedicated to this particular topic,
right,
dealing with the issue of the Mutakallimin and the Ash'a'ira and the Falasifa, the Ash'aris, the Mu'tazila, and the people of Kalam and the philosophers. And in that volume, Nabhani deals with this in terms of, okay, what were the errors in their method of thinking and their method of deduction and induction, and then how did that method lead to certain erroneous or problematic debates and concepts of God, such as the issue of Qada wal Qadr and so forth. But I think that chapter definitely does justice to that question.
And are these books translated into language?
Can someone just briefly translate that Qada wal Qadr? I'm trying to be more cognizant of people who aren't very
predestination.
Exactly, the whole debate about free will and predestination,
because these are debates that are happening right now. I was just listening to another podcast where a couple of atheists were determining predestination, whether are we just a product of our biology of is everything that we're going to do just going to definitely happen no matter what? These are things that are being debated all across
I don't
society.
think that this is like some secret knowledge. I think he's like it's for the public, right?
Oh yeah, it's a public text.
Right.
All of these books that I mentioned,
nobody's saying that.
I think you don't have to buy it. They're on PDF, right?
You won't go to jail for reading it or downloading
it? I'm not sure. No, I'm joking. No, of course not.
And do you guys do you prefer that people don't read PDFs because of copyrights and stuff like that?
No, we don't believe in copyright. Our knowledge and anything we write is of public use for the ummah and for
I'm gonna take your books and put my name on them.
He's gonna make money. He's gonna make money. A capitalist.
Yeah, you gotta do what you gotta do. So, Ali, so your Twitter is Harfouch, ASHARFOUCH. Not to be clarified with the S. The middle initial S is clear.
Yes, I'm not the Depke dancer guy.
Right. Well, we'll wrap this puppy up so we can eat some pizza and wings.
Sounds good.
For our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments, you can email us at themadmamluks@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, give us a 5-star review on iTunes. And for our special guest, Brother Ali Harfouch, and my co-hosts, Sheikh Amr Sayyid and Sim, this is Mahin signing off for the Mad Mamluks. Assalamu alaikum.